Little America 4 Base, Antarctica, February 12, 1947. In the communication bunker's amber glow, Sergeant Mike Kowalski realized someone had been reading his personal letters, annotating them, studying them, and now using that knowledge against him. Welcome to the War Maestro's Archive, where tonight we uncover why Operation Highjump ended 4 months early, and what the Navy discovered about the enemy that was already among them. Operation Highjump represented the most ambitious Antarctic deployment in military history. Admiral Richard Byrd commanded 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and 4,700 personnel in what officials termed a training exercise for polar warfare. The operation's true scope remained classified: advanced reconnaissance missions, equipment testing in extreme conditions, and what intelligence files would later describe as psychological resilience studies under prolonged isolation. By February 1947, the expedition had established multiple bases across the frozen continent, with Little America 4 serving as the primary communication hub linking scattered units to the outside world. The mission parameters seemed straightforward: map uncharted territories, test cold weather gear, and maintain regular contact with Washington. Yet within 6 weeks of deployment, disturbing patterns emerged in communication logs. Personnel reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained radio transmissions, and what medical officers initially dismissed as isolation-induced hallucinations. Supply drops went missing. Entire patrols vanished for days before returning with no memory of their absence. Most troubling, family communications began arriving from relatives who had never sent them. Sergeant Mike Kowalski hunched over the Collins radio set, his breath forming crystalline clouds that settled as frost on the equipment's metal surfaces. Outside, Antarctic wind shrieked through guy wires and support cables, creating a symphony of tortured metal that never ceased. The 28-year-old Polish-American had joined the Navy to escape Chicago's South Side poverty, sending half his monthly pay to support his ailing mother and younger sister Anna. His fingers, stiff with cold despite wool-lined gloves, adjusted frequency dials with practiced precision, while ice crystals formed on the headphone cables. The communication bunker vibrated constantly from diesel generators fighting temperatures that had plummeted to minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Every surface wept condensation that froze instantly, creating patterns of ice that grew throughout each day like living things. The air itself seemed to crack and pop with each breath, carrying the metallic taste of extreme cold that burned the lungs and made speech painful. Chief Petty Officer James Mackenzie entered, stamping packed snow from his boots with sounds like gunshots in the confined space. Each footstep left wet prints that froze within seconds. The 42-year-old veteran's weathered face showed the strain of constant exposure: wind-burned cheeks, eyes that watered continuously from the dry air, lips cracked despite constant application of petroleum jelly. "Still trying to reach Chicago, kid?" Mackenzie asked, his voice slightly muffled by the wool balaclava he rarely removed indoors. Steam rose from his coffee mug like incense, the liquid steaming in the sub-zero air. Kowalski nodded, removing headphones that had grown cold enough to sting his ears. "Third straight week of interference. Sometimes I get fragments, but when I try to respond, everything cuts to dead silence." He gestured toward his workspace, where personal correspondence lay scattered, letters from home that someone had been reading, studying, violating with clinical precision. The realization struck him like Arctic wind. Someone had been analyzing his most private thoughts, cataloging his fears and hopes, building a psychological profile from intimate family communications. And now they were using that stolen knowledge to reach across 8,000 miles of ice and darkness, whispering familiar names into the Antarctic void. The next morning brought fresh horror, disguised as routine maintenance. Kowalski arrived at the communication center to find his personal footlocker standing open, contents meticulously arranged, as if for military inspection. Nothing had been stolen. Instead, everything had been examined with scientific precision. The metal latches still bore frost from overnight temperatures, crackling as they moved in the minus 38-degree air. His letters to Chicago lay in chronological order, each bearing tiny pencil marks in the margins like a professor's annotations. The handwriting was precise, clinical, analyzing his emotional vulnerabilities with methodical thoroughness. Next to a passage describing his mother's worsening cough, primary concern, maternal guilt mechanism. Beside his confession about sending money home instead of saving for his future, self-sacrifice pattern, financial leverage point. Most chilling, alongside his description of missing Anna's last birthday, sibling attachment, critical manipulation vector. Chief Mackenzie found him staring at the violated correspondence, his hands shaking with more than cold. Steam rose from their breath in visible clouds as the heating system struggled against Antarctic temperatures. Ice had formed on the inside of the windows overnight, creating crystalline patterns that fractured the pale morning light. Jesus, kid. Who would analyze personal letters like laboratory specimens? Mackenzie's voice carried genuine outrage, but Kowalski noticed something different in his mentor's demeanor, a wariness that hadn't existed before, as if he were measuring his words more carefully. Someone's building comprehensive psychological profiles, Kowalski replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push. He held up a letter where he had described recurring nightmares about failing his family. The margin note read, "Abandonment anxiety. Maximum exploitation potential." The radio equipment crackled to life without anyone touching the controls. Through speakers designed for long-range communication came a voice that made Kowalski's blood freeze. Anna's voice, speaking with crystal clarity that seemed impossible across thousands of miles. "Mikey? Mikey, can you hear me? I'm so worried about Mama's medical bills, the ones you've been hiding from me." Both men stared at the equipment in stunned silence. The transmission quality was too perfect. No atmospheric interference, no distance distortion that should accompany international broadcasts. More disturbing, Anna had never called him Mikey, and she had known nothing about their mother's mounting medical expenses. Kowalski grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers. Anna, where are you calling from?" The transmission cut to absolute silence, leaving only the constant background noise of wind battering the bunker's exterior walls. Mackenzie checked the communication logs, his weathered face growing pale as he traced signal origins. "Kid, that broadcast originated from inside our compound, somewhere within Little America for itself." His finger tapped coordinates that placed the transmission source less than half a mile from their current location. The implications struck them both simultaneously. Someone within the base possessed recordings of Anna's voice, not just random conversations, but intimate family discussions that Kowalski had never shared with anyone. They had been studying his psychological makeup for weeks or months, gathering intelligence through methods that violated every principle of military conduct. Lieutenant Thorne appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their discovery. His intelligence officer's insignia caught the harsh artificial light, and his expression held the calculating assessment that always made enlisted personnel uncomfortable. "Gentlemen, I need to discuss some irregularities in communication protocols," Thorne announced, his tone carrying authority that discouraged questions. "Sergeant Kowalski, your personal transmissions have attracted attention from operational security. We believe hostile forces may be monitoring family communications to gather intelligence about personnel weaknesses." The explanation felt rehearsed, too convenient to explain away their discoveries. Kowalski realized that Thorne's arrival immediately after Anna's impossible transmission couldn't be coincidental. Someone had been watching, listening, coordinating responses to contain their growing awareness of surveillance operations. In the Antarctic wind howling outside, Kowalski heard something that chilled him more than any polar storm: the sound of predators closing in, using the voices of loved ones as hunting calls. 3 days later, Seaman First Class, Danny Torres, disappeared from a locked room, while temperatures outside dropped to minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Kowalski discovered the absence during the midnight watch rotation, the bunker's metal walls contracting with sharp pops that echoed through the corridors like gunshots. Their shared quarters remained secure, door sealed from the inside, window frames welded shut against Antarctic storms, ventilation grates too small for human passage. The air inside their cramped space carried the metallic taste of extreme cold, and frost had formed intricate patterns on every surface despite the struggling heating system. Torres's personal effects sat undisturbed on his narrow bunk, a half-finished letter to his girlfriend Maria, reading glasses folded neatly beside his pillow, wallet containing $43 still tucked beneath his thin mattress. His wool socks hung from a makeshift clothesline, stiff with ice crystals that tinkled like wind chimes when the building's constant vibration shook them. The 19-year-old Puerto Rican had simply vanished from a space that offered no possibility of exit. Security personnel claimed Torres had requested emergency transfer to the USS Mount Olympus, citing urgent family crisis. They produced documentation bearing his signature, transfer papers completed in his distinctive handwriting, medical clearance stamped by the base physician, even a recorded radio transmission requesting immediate evacuation. The paperwork was flawless, the audio quality crisp despite polar atmospheric interference. But Kowalski had been monitoring all outgoing communications throughout the night shift. No emergency family messages had arrived through official channels. No transfer requests had crossed his desk. Most damning, the radio transmission timestamp showed Torres requesting evacuation at 0347 hours, 4 hours before anyone discovered him missing from quarters that remained locked from inside. Mackenzie examined the transfer documents in the communication center while wind outside reached hurricane intensity, making the entire structure groan like a living thing under stress. Ice particles driven by the storm struck the windows with sounds like machine gun fire, and the air itself seemed to crystallize with each breath. "Kid, this handwriting matches Danny's perfectly," Mackenzie said, comparing signatures to previous requisition forms. Steam rose from his coffee mug in the sub-zero air, even the way he dots his I's and crosses his T's. But the language... He frowned, studying the formal military phrases. Danny never wrote like this. Too many regulation terms, perfect grammar. This reads like someone analyzed his handwriting mechanics but missed his personality entirely. Kowalski felt dread settling in his stomach like ice water as he played the recorded transmission. Torres's voice came through with absolute clarity, speaking in carefully measured tones that lacked his usual rapid-fire Brooklyn accent and nervous energy. The words were Danny's, but the delivery suggested someone reading unfamiliar text from a prepared script. "They're not just forging documents," Kowalski whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "They're manufacturing complete false records, handwriting samples, voice recordings, medical clearances. Someone's been studying Danny's behavioral patterns for weeks, preparing to erase him from official existence." The heating system cycled with a mechanical wheeze, struggling against temperatures that made metal brittle and human survival precarious. Through the frosted windows, the Antarctic landscape stretched endlessly, a white void where men could vanish without trace, where screams would be swallowed by howling wind before traveling 10 feet. During routine equipment maintenance that evening, Kowalski made a discovery that shattered his remaining sense of security. Hidden behind the primary radio console, nestled among cables thick with ice crystals, he found sophisticated recording equipment, military grade, recently installed, still generating enough heat to melt surrounding frost. The device had been capturing every conversation within the communications center, every personal confession, every intimate detail shared during lonely Antarctic nights. But the most chilling revelation came when he traced the device's transmission relay through cables that disappeared into the bunker's frozen infrastructure. The surveillance equipment connected to broadcasting hardware that sent gathered intelligence beyond the base, not to American authorities, but to recipients whose identity remained hidden in electronic shadows. Someone had been harvesting their voices, studying their speech patterns, cataloging their emotional responses, and transmitting that psychological intelligence to handlers who could use it to manufacture perfect deceptions. In the howling Antarctic darkness outside, Danny Torres might still be alive, or his disappearance might have been necessary to perfect the impersonation techniques that would soon target others. Mackenzie returned from a 3-day medical evaluation, changed in ways that made Kowalski's skin crawl with recognition of systematic psychological violation. The transformation manifested in details that accumulated like frost on exposed metal. Mackenzie now stood with rigid military bearing instead of his usual relaxed slouch, his movements precise as clockwork mechanisms. He addressed junior personnel by rank and regulation, rather than the affectionate nicknames that had defined their relationships. Most unnervingly, he had stopped calling Kowalski Kid, a term of endearment that had bridged their generational gap since Norfolk. The communication center felt different with this hollow version of his mentor present. Outside, Antarctic wind screamed through support structures with renewed fury, driving snow against windows with the sound of scattered gravel. Temperatures had plummeted to minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make the bunker's metal framework contract with rifle shot pops that punctuated every conversation. Sergeant Kowalski, Mackenzie said during morning briefing, his voice carrying unfamiliar formality that made the heated air between them feel arctic. Steam rose from his regulation coffee mug, but his hands trembled slightly, the only visible sign of whatever had been done to him during his absence. Kowalski studied his supposed mentor's face, searching for recognition of their shared experiences. Mac, what did they do to you during that medical evaluation? You've been gone 3 days for what should have been routine checkup. Mackenzie's expression remained professionally neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes, fear perhaps, or the shadow of memories too painful to acknowledge. Standard psychological assessment, isolation stress evaluation. Nothing that concerns operational security, Sergeant. The response felt scripted, delivered with the careful precision of someone reciting memorized lines under duress. Kowalski realized with growing horror that Mackenzie hadn't been medically evaluated. He had been psychologically processed, his personality systematically dismantled and reconstructed to serve purposes he might not even consciously understand. Do you remember our conversation about the surveillance equipment? Kowalski pressed, watching for any sign of genuine recognition. The recording devices we found behind the radio console? Mackenzie paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. For a heartbeat, confusion flickered across his weathered features before the professional mask snapped back into place. I have no recollection of unauthorized equipment. Please confine reports to official matters, Sergeant. But Kowalski caught the micro-expression of distress that preceded the denial, the brief widening of eyes that suggested suppressed memories struggling against imposed conditioning. Someone had been inside Mackenzie's mind, selectively editing his recollections, implanting behavioral modifications that overrode his natural paternal instincts. During lunch break in the cramped mess area, Kowalski decided to test his growing suspicions. Ice crystals formed on their exhaled breath as he spoke quietly. "Mac, remember that story you told about taking your son Tommy fishing? How he caught his first bass but threw it back because he felt sorry for it." Mackenzie's fork stopped midway to his mouth, confusion replacing his manufactured composure. "My son's recreational activities are not appropriate duty discussion topics." But the tremor in his voice suggested internal conflict, suppressed memories fighting against implanted restrictions. Kowalski felt ice water flooding his veins. Mackenzie had no son named Tommy. That story belonged to Radio Man Phillips from another unit entirely. Someone had mixed biographical intelligence files, providing this psychologically compromised version of his mentor, with false memories drawn from the wrong personnel dossier. The implications struck him like Antarctic wind. If they could systematically break down and rebuild human personalities through controlled isolation and psychological pressure, then Mackenzie's return represented something far more sinister than simple interrogation. He had become a living surveillance device, his loyalty redirected through techniques that left him unaware of his own compromise. That evening, alone in quarters where the heating system wheezed against temperatures that made survival precarious, Kowalski conducted a desperate review of recent personnel changes. The patterns emerged with crystalline clarity, men disappearing for medical evaluations, returning with subtle personality alterations, behavioral modifications that enhanced compliance while suppressing curiosity and emotional attachment. They weren't replacing personnel with supernatural duplicates. They were manufacturing psychological slaves through scientific torture, turning loyal servicemen into unwilling intelligence assets who genuinely believed they remained patriotic Americans, while unconsciously serving hostile interests. In the howling darkness outside, where wind-carved ice sculptures from metal debris and temperatures could kill exposed flesh in minutes, Kowalski realized he might be one of the last authentic personalities remaining at Little America 4. The enemy had learned to steal human souls while leaving the victims unaware of their spiritual murder. Kowalski awoke to the sound of wind shrieking through the base superstructure, and someone reading his private journal by lamplight. The man wore Danny Torres's uniform, possessed his lean build and characteristic nervous gestures, but spoke with clinical detachment that belonged to no 19-year-old from the Bronx. Metal groaned and contracted around them as Antarctic temperatures plummeted, the bunker walls weeping condensation that froze into crystalline patterns. "Fascinating reading, Michael," the figure said, his voice carrying Danny's familiar accent, but none of his warmth. Steam rose from his coffee cup in the frigid air. Your guilt about Anna's medical bills, your nightmares about failing your mother financially. Excellent psychological intelligence. Kowalski rolled from his bunk, bare feet hitting metal flooring so cold it burned through his socks. The howling wind outside made the entire structure vibrate like a tuning fork. "What did you do with Danny?" "Torres served his purpose admirably. Every conversation you shared provided valuable insight into your emotional vulnerabilities." The man set the journal aside with practiced care. "Did you know he recorded several of your private discussions? We have hours of material. Your voice patterns, emotional triggers, family concerns. Very comprehensive data." The violation cut deeper than physical assault. Kowalski realized their friendship had been weaponized. Intimate conversations harvested to build a psychological profile. The howling wind seemed to echo his internal screams as he grasped the scope of betrayal. "Where is Danny now?" Kowalski demanded, his breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air. Seaman Torres experienced an unfortunate accident during ice patrol, hypothermia, very tragic. The operative's clinical tone made Danny's death sound like a laboratory result, but his intelligence value continues. We've analyzed his speech patterns, studied his handwriting, even practiced his emotional responses to various stimuli. Through the frosted window, Kowalski could see the endless Antarctic wasteland stretching toward darkness. The isolation felt absolute. No help, no witnesses, no escape from the psychological warfare laboratory disguised as a polar expedition. Lieutenant Thorne has been quite cooperative, the operative continued, rising from his chair. Your intelligence officer provided access to personnel files, psychological evaluations, even family correspondence. Every weakness documented, every fear cataloged for future exploitation. The betrayal struck him like Arctic wind. Thorne had orchestrated the entire nightmare, using his position to deliver authentic personnel into enemy hands. Every security briefing had been feeding intelligence to hostile forces studying American military psychology. You've become problematic, Michael. Your curiosity threatens operational security. The operative approached with measured steps, his movements precise as a surgeon. Tomorrow you'll experience a tragic equipment failure, radio accident perhaps, very believable in these conditions. Kowalski lunged for the door, but the operative blocked his path with professional efficiency. The man grabbed his wrist with trained precision, applying pressure that sent lightning through his nervous system. Your replacement won't be some fantasy duplicate, the operative whispered, leaning close. Instead, we'll break you systematically. Isolation, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure until you cooperate. Then you'll return home as our asset, writing letters to your mother with your own hand, speaking to your family with your own voice, but serving interests entirely different from America's. In that moment of crystallizing horror, Kowalski understood their true objective. They weren't creating supernatural copies. They were manufacturing traitors through psychological torture, turning loyal servicemen into unwilling intelligence assets who would return to American soil carrying enemy secrets in their own minds. The wind howled through the base structure as he realized the enemy had perfected something far more insidious than replacement. They had learned to break human souls. Kowalski broke free and sprinted through base corridors as recorded voices of dead comrades echoed from hidden speakers throughout the frozen compound. "Mike, where are you going?" Williams's voice crackled through the intercom system, the recording distorted by static, but unmistakably authentic. The real Williams had been transferred weeks ago, but somehow they possessed hours of his conversations. "Sergeant Kowalski, report to communications immediately." Dr. Henley's authoritative tone boomed from the medical bay speakers. Kowalski had watched them carry the doctor's pneumonia-ravaged body to cold storage, yet his voice lived on in their audio archives. "Kid, you're scaring us. Come back." Mackenzie's familiar baritone followed him down the main corridor, but the recording skipped and repeated like a broken phonograph, revealing its mechanical nature. The base had become a psychological warfare theater, strategically placed speakers broadcasting voices of men who were missing, dead, or compromised. The operatives were herding him toward the communications center, using recorded conversations as acoustic weapons. Kowalski reached the radio room and barricaded the door, his trembling fingers struggling with frozen metal latches. Outside, multiple speakers activated simultaneously, creating a cacophony of familiar voices, all delivering identical scripted phrases. "Michael, you're making this unnecessarily difficult. Open the door, and we can discuss this rationally." He powered up the emergency transmitter, desperation driving him despite numb fingers and equipment crackling with ice crystals. The wind outside reached hurricane intensity, making the entire structure groan like a dying animal. "Mayday, mayday. This is Little America 4 calling any station. Operation Highjump has been compromised. Repeat, the expedition has been infiltrated by hostile intelligence operatives using psychological warfare tactics. Static filled the channel before Admiral Byrd's voice responded with perfect clarity. Sergeant Kowalski, this is Admiral Byrd aboard the Mount Olympus. We're aware of your psychological difficulties. Please remain calm while medical personnel assist you. Kowalski's blood froze. The response came too quickly, demonstrated too much specific knowledge about his situation. They had recordings of command personnel, complete audio libraries for psychological manipulation. Admiral, request authentication code Zebra 7 Alpha. Kowalski transmitted, using verification protocols only genuine command would know. Long silence stretched before the response. Authentication protocols are unnecessary, Sergeant. Your emotional state has deteriorated due to isolation stress. These paranoid delusions are common symptoms of Antarctic psychosis. But the audio quality was too perfect, lacking the static and distortion of genuine long-range transmission. They had been recording everything, building comprehensive voice libraries for precisely this contingency. The barricaded door splintered under coordinated assault. Through the cracks, he glimpsed Mackenzie leading a team of operatives, not supernatural beings, but trained professionals using familiar faces and voices as psychological weapons. The real Mackenzie stood among them, his eyes hollow with defeat, moving with the mechanical compliance of someone whose spirit had been systematically shattered. With frozen fingers, Kowalski switched to unauthorized civilian frequencies, broadcasting on channels monitored by amateur radio operators worldwide. This is Sergeant Michael Kowalski, United States Navy. Operation Highjump has been compromised by enemy forces using advanced psychological warfare. They're breaking American personnel through isolation and manipulation, preparing to send compromised assets back to the mainland. The door burst open. Mackenzie's team flooded in with professional precision, their movements coordinated through training rather than supernatural synchronization. They grabbed him with practiced efficiency, applying restraint techniques that spoke of extensive interrogation experience. As consciousness faded under applied pressure points, Kowalski heard his own voice speaking into the microphone, not a supernatural replacement, but a recording they had made during previous conversations, edited to broadcast reassurances that would cover their tracks. The last thing he saw was Mackenzie's face, tears streaming down weathered cheeks as broken loyalty compelled him to participate in his friend's destruction. 6 weeks later, the USS Mount Olympus sailed into Norfolk Naval Base, carrying 4,700 American servicemen returning from the world's most ambitious polar expedition. But their eyes held the hollow stare of psychological warfare survivors. Families gathered on the dock, waving flags and holding welcome signs, their faces bright with joy and relief. Among them stood Helen Kowalski, clutching a letter from her son promising to visit Chicago immediately after debriefing. She didn't notice the subtle tremor in his handwriting, the slightly formal phrasing that suggested words chosen under duress. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Henderson supervised the disembarkation, noting unusual behavioral patterns among returning personnel. Each man maintained perfect military bearing, responded to orders with mechanical precision, and demonstrated remarkable emotional control despite months of documented psychological pressure. Their medical examinations showed signs of chronic stress. Their psychological evaluations indicated carefully managed responses, and their debriefing reports provided intelligence that seemed almost too comprehensive. Admiral Byrd praised the expedition's success during his official press conference, though careful observers noted the strain around his eyes. Operation Highjump has provided invaluable intelligence about polar warfare capabilities. These men return with knowledge that will serve strategic interests, though some experiences remain classified for national security. The returning servicemen dispersed to bases across the country, carrying commendations and fitness reports that glossed over psychological trauma. They wrote letters to families with slightly altered handwriting, told carefully rehearsed stories about Antarctic adventures, and resumed military careers with enhanced discipline that masked emotional numbness. Sergeant Michael Kowalski returned to Chicago for brief leave, embracing his mother with appropriate affection while his eyes scanned constantly for surveillance. He visited Anna's grave with genuine grief, but Helen noticed how he spoke about Antarctica in practiced phrases, as if reciting memorized lines. When neighbors commented on his maturity and composure, she felt unsettled by the change. Her son had always been expressive, emotional, alive in ways that now seemed carefully suppressed. The man wearing her son's face knew precisely how to comfort her loneliness, which childhood memories to reference, and how to maintain their loving relationship. But he also carried instructions embedded through months of systematic psychological conditioning. Hidden within his subconscious were contact protocols, intelligence gathering techniques, and loyalty modifications that would activate when specific triggers occurred. Across America, similar reunions unfolded as Operation Highjump veterans integrated back into civilian society. They married sweethearts with rehearsed devotion, started families while monitoring neighbors, and pursued careers that provided access to sensitive information. Their Antarctic experience had prepared them for roles they never consciously chose. Unwilling intelligence assets, carrying foreign objectives buried beneath layers of psychological conditioning. The real horror wasn't supernatural replacement. It was the violation of human will through scientific torture. These men genuinely believed they were loyal Americans, yet their subconscious minds had been rewired to serve interests antithetical to everything they consciously valued. They loved their families authentically while unconsciously gathering intelligence about American society. They served their communities with sincere dedication while fulfilling program directives they couldn't even recognize. During sleepless nights, when civilian concerns seemed distant and confused memories of Antarctic psychological sessions surfaced, these compromised veterans would find themselves drawn to specific locations, making seemingly random phone calls or reporting observations they couldn't explain. The conditioning ran so deep that discovery felt impossible. How could they betray secrets they didn't consciously know they possessed? Operation Highjump had succeeded beyond all expectations, but not as a polar exploration mission. It had served as a psychological warfare laboratory, perfecting techniques for converting loyal servicemen into unwilling intelligence assets through systematic mental violation. The expedition's early termination hadn't been due to logistics. It had concluded when enough American personnel had been successfully compromised. The enemy had learned something far more insidious than physical infiltration. They had mastered the art of stealing human souls, while leaving the victims unaware of their own betrayal. And now these broken men walked among us, carrying enemy objectives in minds they no longer fully controlled. If this tale from the War Maestro archive left you questioning the voices around you, take a moment to join our ranks. Check your personal letters, make sure no one's been annotating them, and subscribe to uncover more classified military nightmares. Hit that notification bell. You'll want to know when our next psychological warfare file surfaces from the ice. Share this story with those who understand that the most terrifying enemies are the ones who learn to become us. Remember, some personnel never really returned from Antarctica, but their voices still call home every Wednesday at 1400 hours.